The first time Rachel McGraw saw him, she thought the desert itself had conjured a ghost. The sun had just begun its slow descent behind the distant mesas, painting the sky in molten gold and streaks of fire red, when she noticed the figure standing atop the ridge. He did not move, did not shift, yet the sheer presence of him made the wind seem to halt midair, and the scattering of sagebrush along the slope leaned as though in reverence. Rachel, 30 and recently widowed, felt her pulse quicken. Her life had been a series of losses, a husband claimed by fever, her family scattered across harsh plains, her homestead burned by outlaws who thought grief made her weak. She had thought herself accustomed to solitude, to the lonely, unforgiving quiet of the prairie. But this dark silhouette against the fiery sky made her chest tighten with a fear she could not name. She stepped closer to the edge of the ravine below the ridge, shielding her eyes against the dying sun. Even from this distance, she could make out the sweep of long black hair tumbling over broad shoulders, the glint of tribal jewelry catching the light, a necklace of bones and beads, armlets coiled with intricate patterns and feathers that swayed like shadows in the breeze. His body was taut, sculpted like the sandstone cliffs themselves, every muscle defined under sun-kissed skin. Rachel's breath hitched. She had been told of warriors, but none had ever appeared so silent, so commanding, as if he belonged not to this world but to the wind and stone. Her first impulse was to run. The caution of a widow, the instinct of survival, screamed at her to retreat into the safety of her homestead. Yet something rooted her to the earth, something almost magnetic in the way he held himself. She could feel the weight of his gaze even across the distance, dark and unyielding, pulling her as though the air itself demanded she notice him. For a long moment, the two of them simply existed in separate planes of the same world, the prairie stretching endlessly between them, the golden light softening the harsh lines of the desert, and the hum of insects and distant cattle punctuating the stillness. Rachel tried to rationalize what she saw. Could he be a lost traveler? Perhaps a soldier wandering too far from the army forts? But no uniform marked him, no horse tethered at the ridge, nothing but the stillness and strength of a man who seemed almost more spirit than flesh. The wind shifted, carrying a faint scent of smoke and dry earth. Rachel's eyes narrowed. Had the ridge caught fire somewhere? Or was it the lingering trace of his presence? She felt a chill despite the heat of the day. Her hand went instinctively to the shawl around her shoulders, gripping it as though it could shield her from the unknown. The warrior remained perfectly still, long black hair brushing the sunlit air, the beads of his jewelry catching the last flickers of sunlight, sending tiny reflections across the rocks. Then, as quickly as she had seen him, he disappeared. One heartbeat, two, and the ridge was empty, the horizon as barren as it had been moments before. Rachel's knees weakened, and she sank to a nearby rock, trying to comprehend what she had witnessed. The desert was vast, empty, dangerous. And yet she could not shake the feeling that this man, this silent, powerful figure, was watching her still, somewhere beyond the horizon, waiting. That night, the prairie seemed to hum differently. The crickets, the wind, even the distant howl of coyotes carried a note that Rachel could not place. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small cabin, listening to the familiar creak of the wooden beams, and she heard it. A sound that was not a sound. A presence. Her mind replayed the image of the ridge, the beads glinting, the impossible stillness, and she realized her chest had been holding a breath she didn't know she was taking. For days after, she walked the ridges near her homestead, hoping, fearing, that he might appear again. Each time the wind rustled the sagebrush, her heart leapt. Each time a shadow stretched across the rocks, her pulse quickened. The memory of his figure, his silence, haunted her. It was as though the desert itself had delivered a warning. The world was larger, more dangerous, and infinitely more alive than she had dared to believe. Rachel had been prepared for loneliness, for sorrow, for survival, but she was not prepared for this. The ridge, the fiery sky, and the mysterious warrior had opened something in her chest, a spark of fear, fascination, and hope all intertwined. She did not know who he was, where he came from, or what he wanted. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her life had just shifted, and nothing would ever be the same. 2 weeks had passed since Rachel first glimpsed the mysterious figure on the ridge. The desert had continued its indifferent stretch, scorching by day, freezing by night, and yet the memory of him lingered in every gust of wind and in every shadow that stretched across the plains. She tried to tell herself it was just a trick of her eyes, a lonely mind imagining shapes where none existed, but her chest still tightened every time she remembered the silhouette, the glint of his bone and bead jewelry, the sheer intensity of his presence. That morning, Rachel was hauling grain toward town, the sun just peeking over the mesas when disaster struck. One of the wagon's wheels, old, worn, and cracked, gave way with a loud splintering snap, tossing the sacks of grain into the dust. Rachel stumbled forward, nearly losing her balance, and muttered a string of curses under her breath. Her hands were scratched and bloody from hauling the heavy sacks, her dress soiled with mud, and the morning sun only emphasized the sharp lines of exhaustion etched on her face. She tried to lift the wagon herself, straining against the axle, the splintered wood biting into her palms, but it was hopeless. The wheel had shattered completely, leaving the wagon leaning precariously on one side. Rachel let out a frustrated groan and wiped her sweat-streaked face with the back of her hand. "Great," she muttered to herself. "Just great." As if losing him wasn't enough. Then, movement at the edge of her vision caught her attention. She froze. There, emerging from the mesquite trees at the side of the dusty trail, was him, the warrior from the ridge. The Apache stepped closer, his bare chest glistening in the early sun, long black hair falling over his shoulders, decorated with bone beads and feathers. Every muscle in his body seemed alive, coiled and ready, yet he moved with a calm, deliberate grace that contrasted sharply with his powerful form. Rachel's first instinct was to scream, but she caught herself. The warrior did not approach with a threat. He simply observed her, dark eyes steady, unblinking, as if he had been watching her struggle all along. For a moment, the world fell silent around her, the rustle of wind through the sagebrush, the distant clatter of cattle, even the creak of the wagon seemed to pause. Then, without a word, he stepped forward and lifted the wagon. Not slowly, not awkwardly, he lifted it as if it weighed nothing at all. Rachel's mouth fell open. Her eyes widened as he set the wagon down carefully, adjusting the wheel with precise, practiced movements. He gathered the spilled grain with deliberate efficiency, returning each sack to its place while Rachel stood frozen, unsure whether to be terrified or in awe. Finally, he stepped back and wiped his hands on a strip of leather at his waist. Rachel's throat felt dry. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to ask his name, but no words came. The warrior tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging her presence without demanding anything in return. His gaze was steady, not cruel, not predatory, simply observant, almost reverent. "You? You saved me," she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse from shock and exertion. He did not answer. He merely touched 2 fingers to his throat, then pressed his hand to his chest, a silent gesture that she instinctively understood. He was saying he could not speak, or perhaps he chose not to, but that he had come to protect her nonetheless. Rachel felt a strange warmth creep through her chest. In that simple act of silent communication, she felt an unspoken trust forming, as though the warrior had quietly entered her life to stay. Despite his silence, or perhaps because of it, she sensed a depth of strength and restraint that few men could ever possess. For a long moment, they stood together in the heat of the desert morning, the broken wagon between them like a bridge connecting two worlds, hers, a widow trying to survive alone, and his, a solitary warrior shaped by silence, loss, and unseen battles. Finally, he turned and walked back toward the mesquite trees, his figure receding into the distance as quietly as he had appeared. Rachel watched him go, her hands still trembling, her heart pounding not from fear, but from something entirely new: curiosity, awe, and the stirrings of a strange, unnameable hope. That night, as Rachel sat by the fire in her cabin, she could still see him in her mind, the sun glinting off his jewelry, the taut muscles of his back, the solemn intensity of his eyes. She knew one thing for certain: the man from the ridge was no ordinary traveler. He was part of the desert itself, wild, untamed, and impossible to ignore. And she had a feeling, deep in her bones, that their paths were only just beginning to intertwine. Days passed, and Rachel McGraw could not shake the memory of the warrior's strength and silent presence. The broken wagon incident had left a mark deeper than bruised muscles. It had stirred something in her heart that she had thought long buried. She had survived loss before, endured the cruel solitude of widowhood, but this was different. He was not like the men she had known. No idle words, no shallow charm, no fleeting attentions. He moved with quiet purpose, and his silence carried weight, a stillness that made her own thoughts feel loud in comparison. That evening, Rachel sat at the edge of the barn, her shawl draped around her shoulders against the chill of the approaching night. The sky above bled with the last light of sunset, stars beginning to prick the horizon. Her fingers traced the grain of the wooden fence as she hummed softly, a song her mother had sung to her as a girl. It was a melancholy tune, fragile yet resolute, a melody stitched with memory and loss. She sang more boldly, letting the notes rise and fall, not to be heard, but to keep the quiet from swallowing her whole. Her voice wavered, cracking under emotion, carrying the weight of 2 years of grief, loneliness, and survival. She closed her eyes, imagining her husband, imagining the life that could have been, and let the sorrow flow freely into the desert air. A sudden rustle behind her made her freeze. The air seemed to tighten, the barn's shadow stretching longer. She opened her eyes and gasped. There he was, the warrior, stepping from the tree line at the edge of the pasture, silhouetted by the fading light. His long black hair glinted faintly with the last streaks of sun, his muscular, shirtless form poised with effortless strength. The bone and bead jewelry across his chest and arms caught the light, glimmering as though the stars themselves had landed on him. Rachel's hands instinctively clutched her shawl tighter. I didn't know anyone was there," she stammered, her voice a fragile thread against the evening air. He did not move closer, did not speak. He simply stood there, his eyes fixed on her, absorbing the sound of her song. She realized then that he had not come to interrupt, not to judge. He had come to listen. And somehow, that simple act made her feel seen in a way she had not felt in years. Rachel's voice faltered on the final note. She swallowed hard, unsure if she wanted to speak, to ask his name, to break the tension. But he tilted his head slightly, and she understood. His silence was not cold. It was attentive, reverent. He had come to witness her grief, not to erase it, and that acknowledgment was more comforting than words could ever be. For a long moment, they simply existed together, separated by distance yet linked by unspoken understanding. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath, the whisper of wind through sagebrush, the creak of the barn's timbers, the distant lowing of cattle all fading into quiet, leaving only the space between them. Rachel's throat tightened with emotion. I didn't know I could still sing, she admitted softly, her gaze dropping to the dust at her feet. I thought the years of loss had taken my voice, my heart, everything. The warrior's eyes softened, the first subtle crack in his impenetrable facade. He raised a hand, brushing his fingers lightly over his throat, then pressed it to his chest, a gesture she now recognized. He was telling her he understood, that her voice, her sorrow, had reached him in a way words never could. A shiver ran through her, not from the evening chill, but from the raw connection of two wounded souls finally sensing each other. She realized that in singing her grief aloud, she had not just relieved herself, she had drawn him closer, broken the first barrier of his silence, and revealed a truth she had never expected, that her voice, her tears could matter to another dot as the last light faded. The warrior stepped back toward the trees, his figure merging with the shadows. Rachel watched him go, a strange ache settling in her chest, not longing, not fear, but a curious, fragile hope. The song she had sung lingered in the air as if the desert itself had absorbed it and carried it to him. That night, Rachel lay awake, hearing her own voice echo in her mind, mingling with the memory of his dark, intense gaze. She had no name for what she felt, no certainty of what the future held, but one thing was undeniable. She was no longer entirely alone. And somewhere in the desert night, she felt certain he was no longer entirely silent. The desert sky darkened faster than Rachel McGraw could have anticipated. Clouds rolled in from the west, thick and swollen, casting shadows over the homestead and bending the sagebrush in their fury. A distant rumble of thunder echoed across the mesas, a warning that the storm would not wait. Rachel hurried to secure her small ranch, her hands trembling as she tied down the tarps over the wagon, checked the corral gates, and tried to herd the remaining animals into the barn. Her hair clung to her face, damp with sweat and fear, her dress heavy with the weight of mud and dust. She barely noticed the rain until it started in sharp, icy needles stinging her exposed arms. The wind whipped harder, shaking the barn's wooden boards, tearing at the corners of her tarps. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled with the gates, knowing that if they were not secure, the livestock could escape or worse, be carried off by a flash flood racing through the gullies. Then, through the sheets of rain and gusting wind, he appeared. The Apache warrior, muscular, shirtless, his long black hair plastered to his back and shoulders, bone and bead jewelry swinging with each deliberate step. Water rolled off his body like it had no weight, his presence an unshakable force against the chaos of the storm. Rachel's breath caught. She had never seen him move through danger with such ease, as if he were a part of it rather than merely enduring it. He did not speak. He never did. But his eyes, dark and unwavering, scanned the barn, the animals, and finally her, assessing and commanding at once. Rachel felt her panic begin to ebb, replaced by an unexpected sense of calm. She realized that she could rely on him, that in this moment she was not alone. Together, though without words, they worked in tandem. He held the barn door steady as Rachel pounded in a loose beam, muscles straining under the pressure of both effort and rain. He gathered the animals into the safety of the stall, his hands moving like lightning, his grip firm yet gentle. The wind tore at their bodies, but they moved as one, silent and unbroken in rhythm. When a particularly violent gust slammed the barn doors, Rachel stumbled backward, fear striking her chest like a knife. Before she could cry out, his hand was on her shoulder, calloused, warm, steady. She looked up at him, rain streaking her face, eyes wide and heart hammering. His expression, for the first time, betrayed more than stoic calm. It was urgent, protective, and full of quiet insistence that she remain safe. "You don't have to do this alone," she whispered, shivering in the downpour, barely aware she had spoken aloud. The words seemed to hang in the storm, fragile and human. For a brief moment, the warrior's lips parted as if he might respond. But he did not speak. Instead, he placed a hand on his chest, then touched his throat lightly, his silent way of acknowledging her words, accepting them and returning the unspoken trust she offered. Rachel understood perfectly. She was not alone. She never had been, not truly, and certainly not now. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. When the storm finally began to wane, leaving a sheen of water over the desert and steam rising from the soaked earth, Rachel and the warrior stood together by the barn, soaked to the bone. The wind had died to a whisper, and the night sky revealed the first brave stars glimmering through the clouds. Her shawl clung to her, heavy and dripping, but she felt no chill. She felt his presence, steady and grounding, and the realization struck her that the warrior was no longer just a figure from the ridge. He had entered her life fully, uninvited but necessary. As she gazed at him, Rachel's throat tightened with emotion she could neither name nor restrain. Fear, awe, admiration, and something else, a fragile hope, swirled within her like the desert wind after a storm. He did not speak, and yet his silence was no longer distant or cold. It was deliberate, intimate, and for the first time, Rachel realized she longed to hear him, even if only for a single word. The desert lay quiet around them, alive with the scent of wet sage and turned earth. The storm had passed, but something far stronger had begun, a bond forged in fear, survival, and unspoken understanding. Rachel knew, deep in her heart, that the days ahead would test her more than the storm ever could, and that the warrior beside her would play a part she could not yet fathom. The prairie had been quiet for days, almost deceivingly so. Rachel McGraw had begun to feel a fragile sense of security at her homestead, the memory of the storm lingering only as a reminder that nature could be both cruel and protective. She had rebuilt fences, patched the barn roof, and allowed herself small moments of peace, humming softly as she worked. But the town and its people had other ideas. Word traveled fast in these parts, as it always did. The rumor that a widow was being accompanied by an Apache warrior spread like wildfire, igniting whispers, sideways glances, and outright hostility. Rachel noticed the change immediately. At the mercantile, women turned away, muttering under their breath. At church, eyes cut her as sharply as any blade. Even the local sheriff's nod was hesitant, tinged with suspicion. "They think he'll take you," one woman spat near her boots as Rachel passed. Better a dead husband than a savage for company. Rachel's cheeks flushed, anger and humiliation rising within her, but she held her head high. She had endured grief, loss, and isolation. She would endure their judgment too. Still, the words lingered in her mind, gnawing like the relentless desert wind. She wondered what it was about him that frightened them so. Was it the power he carried in his silence? The strength etched into every line of his body? Or did they fear what they could not understand? Loyalty, honor, and quiet courage. It was then, on the road home from town, that the real danger appeared. Outlaws, rough and hungry, eyes glittering with greed and malice, cornered her wagon. Their leader, a broad man with a scar running down his cheek, sneered. "Well, well, what do we have here? A widow playing house with an Indian?" Laughter rippled through the group, crude and mocking, and Rachel felt the familiar tightening of fear in her chest. Her hands gripped the reins as her wagon teetered on uneven ground, and she realized with a pang of despair that there was nowhere to run. The outlaws moved closer, encircling her, the metallic scent of danger heavy in the air. She braced herself for the worst. Then he appeared. The warrior. Muscular, shirtless, his long black hair wet from the midday sun or perhaps sweat from his swift approach, adorned with bone and bead jewelry that caught the harsh light. He dropped from a ridge above the road, silent as a shadow, landing with cat-like precision between Rachel and the outlaws. Time seemed to slow. Dust swirled in the sudden breeze, and the leader's laughter faltered. The warrior did not speak, but his presence alone commanded attention. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready, a storm of power contained within calm restraint. He did not advance, did not make a move, yet the silence was louder than any gunshot. Rachel watched, heart hammering, as the outlaws shifted uneasily. Finally, with a sudden motion like a striking hawk, he moved. The fight was brief, brutal, and efficient. Fists and knives clashed against muscle and reflex, but the warrior's skill was unmatched. Rachel could hardly follow the blur of movement, only knowing that when it ended, the outlaws lay groaning and incapacitated, dust and blood mingling with sweat under the afternoon sun. The warrior stood before her, chest heaving, his dark eyes locking with hers. She stepped forward, trembling, reaching for his arm, feeling the warmth and solidity beneath her fingertips. "Why do you risk yourself for me?" she whispered, her voice a fragile echo of the storm and struggle they had just survived. For the first time, he spoke, his voice low and rough like gravel sliding over stone. "Because your tears gave me back my voice." Rachel's chest tightened. He had always been silent, a shadow in the desert, a mystery. And yet, somehow, her grief, her sorrow, and the simple act of living had drawn him to her, compelled him to act. The connection between them, invisible and unspoken, had grown stronger than fear, stronger than scorn, stronger than the desert itself. The sun dipped low, painting the desert in warm amber light as Rachel steadied herself beside him. The outlaws were far behind, but their presence had left a residue of tension and clarity. She realized with a surge of awe and trembling hope that the warrior was no longer merely a protector. He was a partner in silence and strength, a force tethered to her grief, yet bound to her by something far deeper than words. That night, as she tended the animals and prepared her modest cabin for the dark desert hours, Rachel could not shake the image of him, muscular, scarred, silent, powerful, yet infinitely patient. The world might scorn her, fear him, and misunderstand them both, but she knew one truth with absolute certainty. He would stand beside her, unflinching, and she would never be alone again. The sun had just begun its slow descent when Rachel McGraw hit the trail toward town, hauling a small supply wagon behind her. The desert was calm, deceptive in its stillness, the air shimmering above the hot earth. She had grown accustomed to long rides alone, confident in her knowledge of the terrain, yet the memory of the Apache warrior's protective presence lingered in her mind. She had hoped today would be uneventful, an ordinary journey without the threat of storms, bandits, or the desert's relentless unpredictability. She was wrong. The canyon ahead, usually a welcoming shortcut, felt different that day shadows stretched longer. Rocks seemed to lean closer, and the wind carried an ominous metallic scent. Rachel's stomach tightened as she urged her mule forward, the wagon creaking under the strain. Then the figures appeared, outlaws, no fewer than 5, emerging from the narrow canyon bends. Their eyes glinted with greed and cruelty, hands resting on the weapons at their belts. Rachel froze. She gripped the reins, her pulse racing. There was no time to turn back. The canyon's walls were steep, and the narrow path offered little room for escape. The outlaws advanced, laughter cruel and low, closing in with a predator's confidence. Fear clawed at her chest, and for a fleeting moment she thought of running, of surrendering, but she could not abandon the wagon, the supplies, or the fragile independence she had fought so hard to maintain. Then he appeared, the Apache warrior, dropped from a rocky ledge above the canyon, his long black hair whipping in the desert wind, bare chest glistening, muscles taut with purpose. Bone and bead jewelry jingled softly with each controlled movement. Time seemed to slow as he landed, silent as a shadow, directly between Rachel and the advancing men. The outlaws faltered, unsure whether to advance or flee, caught off guard by his sudden, commanding presence. Rachel's heart leapt, not just from relief, but from awe. The warrior had always been a figure of mystery, his silence deep and compelling. Now, in the face of danger, he became something else entirely, a force of nature, controlled and precise, a living storm. The fight began in a flurry of motion. The Apache warrior moved like water over rocks, fluid, unstoppable, each strike calculated, each dodge perfect. Fists collided with bone, knives glanced off muscle, dust and grit flew into the air. Rachel could hardly follow the blur of action, only knowing that when the dust settled, the outlaws were groaning and incapacitated, strewn along the canyon floor. When the last man fell, the warrior turned to Rachel, chest heaving, eyes dark and intense. She stepped forward, hands trembling, reaching for his arm. "Why do you risk yourself for me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the canyon wind. For the first time, he spoke. His voice was low, rough, and deliberate, like gravel sliding across stone. "Because your tears, your voice, brought me back." Rachel's chest tightened as comprehension struck her. His silence had never been absence, it had been waiting. Waiting for her presence, her grief, her courage. Her very existence had stirred something in him, something more than instinct, more than honor. Something deeper, something unspoken yet undeniable. The canyon fell quiet again, the wind carrying their breaths, the scent of dust and sun-baked earth thick around them. Rachel realized that in the Apache warrior, she had found a protector, a companion, and perhaps, unknowingly, the first man in years who understood the language of her heart. As the last rays of sun spilled over the canyon walls, bathing them in amber light, Rachel felt a trembling hope she had not allowed herself in years. The warrior's eyes, fierce and solemn, met hers, and in that gaze, she recognized not just strength, but trust, patience, and a promise unspoken. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging the bond that had formed in the crucible of danger. Rachel McGraw had survived storms, scorn, and violence alone, but now, beside this silent, powerful warrior, she realized she was no longer truly alone. And somewhere deep within, she knew that their journey together was only just beginning. The desert night was quiet, almost deceptively so. Rachel McGraw had spent countless hours awake under the stars, tending to her homestead, listening to the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush, and feeling the constant pull of memory and loss. Yet tonight, something was different. The air seemed charged, almost electric, carrying the scent of earth and distant fire. Her heart thumped in her chest, a mixture of anticipation and fear. She had not expected him tonight, the Apache warrior who had silently entered her life, who had become her protector, her mystery, and unexpectedly, her anchor. And yet, she had a deep instinctive certainty that he would appear. The sound of movement startled her. From the shadows at the edge of the desert, he emerged. Muscular, shirtless, long black hair damp with sweat and dust, adorned with the bone and bead jewelry that had first drawn her awe, he moved with the silent authority of a predator and the grace of the wind. His dark eyes, unwavering and intense, locked on hers, and she felt the familiar tremor of awe and longing ripple through her. Tonight, they were not just survivors of storms and outlaws. Tonight, they were two souls who had seen the depths of fear, grief, and isolation, and had found one another in that shared crucible. Rachel stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. I never expected to see you again tonight." He did not answer immediately. His silence had always carried meaning, and now it seemed to pulse with urgency. Finally, he took a slow step closer, the firelight from the small cabin flickering across his sculpted chest. Then, softly, low and deliberate, he spoke, his voice rough and gravelly, "Because I cannot stay silent anymore." Rachel's breath caught. She had grown used to his quiet, had found solace in the weight of his gaze and the power of his presence, but these words, These few syllables carried the force of a lifetime. They spoke of protection, loyalty, and something deeper, something she had not dared to name. She began, but the words faltered, insufficient for the emotions surging through her. She had lived years in silence, surviving tragedy and loneliness, and yet she had never felt entirely helpless until she met him. Now, standing before him, she realized that her heart had been waiting for a presence like his, for a strength so vast it made her fear and grief seem small in comparison. The warrior stepped even closer, until the warmth of his body brushed hers. His fingers, calloused yet gentle, lifted to her cheek, tracing the line of her jaw, a silent acknowledgment of every tear she had shed, every song she had sung, every moment she had survived alone. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, a mix of fear, relief, and a fragile, overwhelming hope. "You are not alone," he murmured, voice low, carrying a weight that resonated with every corner of her heart. "And I will not let you be." She reached up, her hands trembling, pressing against his chest, feeling the strength and warmth beneath her fingertips. I trust you," she whispered. I think I always have." For the first time, the warrior's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, a release of the tension he had carried through countless battles, storms, and nights of silence. The desert night seemed to exhale, the wind softening, the stars glowing brighter, as if the universe itself acknowledged the bond forming between them. They stood together, side by side, not needing words, their shared history of loss, danger, and survival forming an unspoken language more powerful than speech. The desert, harsh and relentless, had brought them together, tested them, shaped them, and ultimately bound them. Rachel rested her head lightly against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and for the first time in years she felt truly safe. Not merely protected from the storms and outlaws of the world, but understood, valued, and connected to a presence as powerful as the desert itself. The Apache warrior lowered his head, brushing his lips lightly against her hair, a silent promise, an acknowledgment of love and loyalty forged in silence and danger. Rachel closed her eyes, letting herself surrender to the moment, to the strength, and to the quiet intensity that had always been his gift. In the desert's vast silence, under the canopy of stars, two hearts finally spoke without words. And in that silence, they found the bond that would carry them through every storm, every trial, and every challenge the harsh Old West could throw their way. Rachel McGraw had survived loss, solitude, and fear, but now with him, she had found something far more enduring, a companion, a protector, and the first man who had truly seen her and who she could finally see in return.